You can leave. The house is mine. The accounts are mine. Everything we built together mine. Sloane Ketteridge slid the folder across the walnut table and didn't bother to look up as Rowan Castellani signed his name on the divorce papers. He didn't argue. He pulled off his wedding ring, set it on the table between them, thanked his attorney quietly, and walked out into a March rain in Philadelphia, with his black wool coat soaking through at the shoulders. 3 hours later, he was on a gurney in the emergency department at St. Bridget Hospital, with 2 bullet wounds under his left ribs, and the woman pressing both hands into the wound to keep him alive 11 minutes, without letting go. Once was a 27-year-old night shift nurse, earning $29 an hour. She never asked his name. She had no idea who the 4 men in black coats standing in her hallway were, or why not one of them ever sat down. She had no idea that the man bleeding under her hands controlled the entire Delaware waterfront. Sloane was still at a restaurant on Walnut Street, celebrating, but there was something none of the 3 of them knew yet. Something that had been sitting quietly in an old man's desk drawer for 3 years, waiting for this exact night to begin opening. If you want to find out what Sloane discovers about the man she just divorced, stay with us. This one goes a lot further than you think. Hit like and share the story if it's pulling you in. And if these are the kinds of stories you love, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. 3 hours before that gurney rolled through the automatic glass doors, Maren Voss was standing at the head of Corridor B with a cup of cold coffee in her hand and 37 minutes left in her first shift. She worked doubles on Tuesdays and Fridays, 16 hours straight, not because the hospital was short-staffed, but because she needed the number at the end of the month to come out a certain way. The emergency department at St. Bridget Hospital sat on the edge of Kensington, and it knew exactly what it was. No one came there by choice. People came because it was the closest place, or because it was the only place still open, or because they had nowhere else left to go. Maren had worked there for 4 years, and she had learned that most of the job wasn't found in textbooks. It was found in remembering names. She knew Marvin Otley slept in the east corner of the gas station on Lehigh Avenue and always asked for extra sugar. She knew Dorothea, who had come in 8 times over 2 years and apologized every single time for being a bother. She knew who needed someone to talk to, and who needed to be left alone. In the pocket of her lab coat was a worn piece of paper folded into quarters, handwritten with the phone numbers of 7 different places, 2 treatment centers, 1 shelter, 1 legal aid hotline, 1 organization that helped pay for medication, and 2 personal numbers belonging to people who had once told her to call anytime. She had given that piece of paper to more people than she could count. She had never called any of those numbers for herself. The gurney in Corridor B had 1 crooked wheel. It squeaked in rhythm, a small, steady, repeating sound every time someone pushed it across the strip of flooring that joined the 2 sections. Maren had submitted a maintenance request 4 times in 11 months. The first time, they said they would take a look. The second time, they said it had been noted. The third and fourth times, no one said anything at all. She still pushed that gurney on every shift, and she had grown so accustomed to the sound that sometimes she heard it in her sleep. And she had also stopped thinking there was anything unusual about that. Ruthie Bascom, the charge nurse on the night shift, walked past and tossed her a ballpoint pen. "The 7th one this week," Ruthie said. "You should tie 1 to your wrist." Maren caught it and slipped it into her pocket beside the folded piece of paper. She lost pens constantly, almost systematically. Those cheap plastic pens printed with the words St. Bridget Hospital, the lettering fading after only a few hand washings. She left them on the triage desk, on top of the medication cart, in other people's pockets, inside ambulances. That was the kind of person she had become. Someone who could remember the names of 40 patients, but couldn't hold on to a single pen. The amount was $4,100 a month. Brookhaven Care in Bensalem, room 214, with a window overlooking the parking lot and a row of maple trees that had turned beautifully red the previous fall. Teddy Voss was 22 years old. 3 years earlier, he had still been in school, still arguing with his sister over who got to use the car, still texting her at midnight in sentences without punctuation. Now he lay there. Machines did the things his body could no longer do, and the doctors used words like persistent vegetative state, and no one offered a timeline because no one had a timeline to give. On Sunday mornings, Maren drove 35 minutes to see him. She brought the sports section and read him the results of the Phillies games, the scores, the pitchers, who had scored in which inning. He couldn't hear her. She knew that, and the nurses at Brookhaven knew it too, and no one said anything. Teddy had once cared about those games, and Marin couldn't find a reason convincing enough to stop. Sometimes, she read through the end of the 9th inning and then sat in silence for 15 minutes before standing, straightening the blanket at the foot of his bed, and driving back in time for the night shift. Her mother had died during the winter when Marin was 15. Marin never told anyone the details, and no one ever asked a second time. That night, 3 hours before everything changed, she was standing at the head of Corridor B doing the math in her head. A double shift on Tuesday, a double shift on Friday, and 2 more weekend shifts if Ruthie could fit them into the schedule. The number was still short by $260. She had calculated it 3 times, and it was still short by exactly that amount. She finished the cold coffee, dropped the cup into the trash, and went back to work. She hadn't asked anyone for anything since she was 15 years old. When she asked, and no one came, 3 weeks before that morning in the mediation room on Market Avenue, Rowan Castellani walked the length of Pier A at 4 o'clock in the morning, with a cup of black coffee in one hand, and no one beside him. He had done it almost every day for 12 years. Not because any schedule required it, but because 4 o'clock in the morning was the only hour when a port told the truth. Before the first shift came in, before the cranes started moving, before the noise covered everything that had begun to slip out of place and that no one was ready to speak about yet. He walked from one end of the pier to the other, and he watched. He didn't take notes. He simply watched, and he remembered. And 3 days later, someone would receive a very short question and wouldn't understand how he had known enough to ask it. On the steel post at the entrance to warehouse, one hung an enamel sign whose paint had almost entirely peeled away, there since 1991, bearing 4 words Silvio Castellani had written in his own hand. No drugs on our docks. 30 years, and the sign was still there. And in all those 30 years, the rule had never been broken, not because everyone loved it, but because every person who had ever tried no longer worked anywhere along that river. Rowan never raised his voice. That was something the people around him needed time to understand. He didn't pound tables, didn't swear, didn't make threats, but when he lowered his voice, when he slowed his words by half a beat, that was when they needed to be afraid. And anyone who had been there long enough knew it, and anyone who didn't know it yet eventually would. Gus Ferraro was waiting halfway down the pier, exactly where he always waited, leaning against a stack of pallets, with 2 cups of coffee in his hands, even though he knew perfectly well Rowan already had one. He had been doing that for 40 years, first for Silvio, then for Silvio's son, and he had never explained why. He was 68 years old, and had walked with a limp since 1994. His left leg never healing properly after something he had never told anyone in full, not even Rowan, not even during the long nights on the pier, when both of them knew there was no one left to overhear. When a third person was present, he called Rowan Mr. Castellani. When it was only the 2 of them, he called him boy, and Rowan was already 40 years old and had never corrected him once. Pier C, Gus said, holding out the second cup of coffee even though it wouldn't be taken. The 11th month in a row. The numbers aren't any better than last month. They aren't much worse, but they aren't better. Rowan looked out across the river. Mist was rising from the water, and the lights of Camden were still burning on the opposite shore. He asked for the exact figure, and Gus gave it, and the 2 of them stood in silence for a while. 400 families, Rowan said at last. Those 3 cold storage warehouses feed 400 families. Closing Pier C would save me money I don't need, and 120 people would lose their jobs in a neighborhood where there aren't any other jobs waiting for them. Gus nodded. He had known the answer before he asked. He still asked every month because that was the work of an advisor, and because some questions had to be spoken aloud before their answers could carry any weight. Your father wouldn't close it either, Gus said, but he would have cursed at me for 30 minutes before deciding not to. Rowan gave a quiet laugh. It was the closest thing to laughter he had allowed himself during those months. Gus straightened, shifting his weight onto his right leg the way he always did after standing too long, and he looked at the son of his dead friend with an expression Rowan wouldn't understand until much later. Boy, he said, there are things I do for you that you'll never know about, and that's my job. Rowan laughed a second time. You're talking about the electric bill, he said. Gus shrugged and drank the extra cup of coffee, and the 2 of them continued toward the far end of the pier. And the sun hadn't risen yet, and Rowan Castellani didn't give those words another second of thought for the next 4 months. The Fairmount Arts Foundation's spring fundraiser was held in the Grand Hall of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, beneath a ceiling 12 meters high and lights rented specifically for that evening. Sloane Ketteridge had spent 4 months preparing it. She knew the names of all 170 guests, knew who should sit beside whom, knew who had recently divorced and shouldn't be placed at the same table with whom. It was what she was good at, and she was truly good at it, and no one in that room would have denied it. Rowan stood beside her at the edge of the crowd in a dark suit his tailor had altered 3 times, and that still didn't sit entirely comfortably across his shoulders. He didn't drink. He held a glass of water with lemon in his hand throughout the evening, because holding something made people less likely to come over and start a conversation. A silver-haired man from the museum's board of trustees stopped in front of them and asked Sloane a question about the upcoming campaign, then turned to Rowan, with the kind of courtesy that was required rather than offered, and asked what he did for a living. Sloane answered before Rowan could open his mouth. "My husband," she said. "He works in transportation." She said it in a very particular tone. It wasn't rude. There was nothing anyone could object to if the exchange had been recorded. But she set the words down in a way that made the man across from her understand at once that the subject was closed, that there was nothing more behind that sentence, that asking another question would only embarrass the person asking it. The silver-haired man nodded, said something about fuel prices, then turned back toward Sloane and didn't look at Rowan again for the rest of the conversation. Rowan heard it. He always heard it. He took a sip of water and looked toward the grand staircase, and he let it pass, as he always did. 7 years earlier, that steadiness had been the very thing she loved. She had told her friends that he was the only man she had ever met who did exactly what he said he would do, that he never made promises simply because they sounded good, that when he said he would be there at 7 o'clock, he was there at 7 o'clock. She loved the way he could look at something broken and see what it might become. Then, somewhere around the 4th year or the 5th, the way she saw him began to shift. His steadiness stopped being a virtue and started becoming a ceiling. He would always be this way. He would never become anything different. The dinners she attended grew more expensive. The people seated around her began talking about investment portfolios and apartments in Rittenhouse Square. And when she looked across at her husband, she saw a man whose hands didn't resemble the hands of anyone else in the room. What Sloane didn't know, what she had no possible way of knowing, was that the man she was slowly making smaller at parties controlled everything that moved along 23 kilometers of the Delaware River waterfront. He had never told her. It wasn't a deception. At least he didn't call it that to himself. 3 weeks before Silvio Castellani died, he lay in a bed inside a South Philadelphia room, overlooking a concrete yard, and he took his son's wrist and said only one thing about it. "Don't tell her. If she loves you for what you are, she'll stay even after she knows. If she needs to know before she'll stay, then she was never truly staying." Rowan argued with him. His father didn't answer. He only looked at him until Rowan stopped arguing. Rowan had intended to tell her. He had thought about it in the 2nd year, then the 3rd, then the 4th. He waited for some evening when they were both calm, when nothing was urgent, when she would have enough room inside herself to hear everything before making a decision. He waited 7 years for that right moment. The moment did come, but it came too late, and when it arrived, it was no longer a confession. It was evidence. At the bar at the far end of the grand hall, a 41-year-old man in a tailored suit stood beside Sloane and told her he had been following her work for 3 years. Preston Halloran was polished, but not with refinement. It came from practice, the kind of polish something acquired after being wiped again and again until it could reflect whoever happened to be standing in front of it. "Larga," he smiled with the lower half of his face. "You're the only person in this room who knows what she's doing," he said, "and you're wasting yourself managing other people's reputations." Sloane had heard flattery throughout her 15 years in the profession. She knew how to brush it aside. She didn't brush that sentence aside. During the 11 months after that evening at the museum, Preston Halloran dismantled a 7-year marriage 1 brick at a time, the way a skilled craftsman takes apart a load-bearing wall. He never spoke badly of Rowan, not even once. He only asked questions. Had Rowan ever asked what she wanted 5 years from now? Did she think he truly understood how complicated her work was? Did she find it strange that a man who owned 3 cold storage warehouses never talked about them? Each question was harmless on its own. Taken together, they removed 1 brick after another, and the structure still looked as though it were standing until the exact day it wasn't. By January, Sloane had been sleeping in the guest room for 4 months, and both of them were still calling it temporary. She came home at 9 o'clock that evening, with a folder tucked beneath one arm and an expression Rowan recognized immediately, because it was the expression she wore only when she spoke about her mother. Mrs. Ketteridge had been living in a care facility in Bryn Mawr since the fall. The week before, the doctor had used the kind of phrase people only used after they had run out of every other phrase. Sloane placed the folder on the kitchen table and said the family attorney needed the son-in-law's consenting signature on the medical power of attorney, that Pennsylvania law required it when the designated agent was an only child, that she had asked twice and had been given the same answer both times. She spoke in the voice of someone who had cried earlier in the car and wiped her face before walking into the house. Rowan had no reason to doubt her because most of it was true. That was what made the document more effective than any contract. It had emotion inside it. Reading it carefully would have felt cruel. Sitting down, turning every page, examining every line while the woman across from him waited to sign papers for her dying mother would have been the act of a heartless man, and Rowan Castellani had spent his entire life trying not to be seen that way inside his own home. He turned through the first 4 pages. The authorization clause, the scope of medical decisions, the list of contacts. He took out his pen. He looked at Sloane once, and she was staring down at the table, and he lowered the tip of the pen toward the signature line. The point touched the paper. Then the folder shifted slightly beneath his hand, and he noticed that page 7 was stuck to page 8. It wasn't deliberate. A paperclip had been fastened crookedly at the upper corner, pressing the 2 sheets together and leaving a faint crease along the edge. He separated them with his thumb, a completely mechanical gesture, the gesture of a man who had handled thousands of files in his life and disliked folded pages. Page 8 wasn't a continuation of page 7. It was a transfer addendum. The language was entirely different. The typeface differed by the smallest degree. And in the middle of the page was a parcel identification number. Pier 34 North. Rowan had looked at that number in port records for 12 years. He had seen it on the map hanging in the Pier A office. He had heard his father read it aloud one afternoon in 2006, while explaining why that piece of land mattered more than everything built on top of it. Rowan's expression didn't change. That was what 12 years had taught him, and they had taught him well. He capped the pen, closed the folder, and said he would read it carefully in the morning because his eyes were tired, and he didn't want to sign the wrong thing when it concerned her mother. Sloane looked up, for one very brief moment, so brief that later he wouldn't be certain he had truly seen it. Something passed across her face. It wasn't fear. It was closer to calculation. Then she said, of course, tomorrow morning was fine, picked up her glass of water, and went into the guest room. Rowan remained at the kitchen table for another 20 minutes after the guest room light went out. He listened to water moving through the pipes and to a car turning at the end of the street. Then he picked up the folder, walked into his study, and closed the door. He photographed every page, all 23 of them, including the cover, including the blank back of the final page, including the crooked paperclip at the upper corner. He worked slowly, checking every photograph before moving to the next page, because he knew he would only have one chance. Then he returned the folder to its exact place on the kitchen table, at precisely the same angle as before, and went to bed. The following morning, Rowan signed the medical power of attorney. He signed the first 6 pages, struck through page 8 with a line of ink, and wrote in the margin that the addendum didn't fall within the scope of the document. Then he handed it back to Sloane and told her that her family attorney had accidentally clipped another client's document into the file, and that she should remind them to be more careful. Sloane took it, glanced through it, and said she would. She didn't ask what page 8 was about. That was the detail Rowan remembered, and it carried more weight than everything he had read on the paper. He sent all 23 photographs to Gus Ferraro at 4:15 that morning from Pier A, standing beneath the peeling enamel sign. Gus didn't ask what Rowan wanted to do. He only asked whether Rowan wanted the result quickly, or wanted it done correctly, and Rowan said correctly, and Gus ended the call. The person he found was a forensic document examiner in Baltimore, a woman who had retired from the profession but still accepted private work from those who came through the right introductions. She worked on it for 9 days. The report was 11 pages long, and Gus read every page before handing it over, because that was his job. The 2 signatures attributed to Rowan on documents connected to the Pier 34 North parcel hadn't been written by his hand. They had been copied digitally from 2 older contracts, one from 2019 and the other from 2022, both of which had been kept in the safe inside the study at home. Whoever had done it had been careful. The resolution had been processed, the ink had been simulated, and the angle had been adjusted slightly so the 2 signatures wouldn't appear identical. But there was one thing that couldn't be copied: the pressure of the pen on the final stroke. Rowan had a habit of pressing harder on the last sweeping line of the letter I in Castellani, a very slight emphasis that left a mark darker than the rest. On the copies, that darker mark was present, but it remained evenly dark from beginning to end, like a line that had been traced over, rather than one written by a hand coming to a stop. On the final page, the examiner wrote that she had worked in the profession for 26 years, and that this was the third best forgery she had ever seen. She added that whoever had made it had access to the originals. The safe in the study was the kind that kept an electronic access log. Rowan had never looked at that log because, in 7 years, he had never had a reason to. He looked at it on Thursday night, alone, with the door closed. The safe had been opened 5 times during the 6 weeks before Christmas, using the correct code, with no sign of forced entry. He opened Sloane's calendar on the shared tablet they had both forgotten was shared. He compared every date: November 19th, November 27th, December 6th, December 13th, December 18th. All 5 were evenings when he had been at the port. 3 of them were nights when he had texted her in advance to say he would be home late. He sat with that fact for a very long time. Not with the evidence, because the evidence was clear, and evidence didn't hurt him. He sat with the detail that she had waited for him to send the message. Gus came to Pier A the next morning carrying 2 cups of coffee, as he always did. The fog was thicker than usual, and they walked the entire length of the pier in silence before he spoke. "Boy," he said, "do you want me to handle this your father's way, or your way?" Rowan didn't answer at once. He knew exactly what his father's way meant. He had grown up in that house, and he knew what had happened to the man who stole money from Silvio in 1994. And he knew why Gus had walked with a limp ever since. Rowan had everything he needed to choose that path. He had the people, he had the means, and in that moment, he had the reason as well. Fog drifted across the surface of the river. Somewhere behind them, a crane began powering up for the first shift. "My way," Rowan said. "No one gets touched yet. I need to know everything first." Gus nodded once. He didn't look relieved, and he didn't look disappointed. He simply finished the extra cup of coffee and said he would need another 6 weeks. 3 weeks later, Sloane filed for divorce. The mediation took place on Market Avenue, on the 11th floor, inside a room with a walnut table and a window overlooking City Hall. She arrived with her own attorney and a typed list. She wanted the house, the joint accounts, and a percentage of the transportation company's future revenue. At the 80th minute, she set down her pen and delivered the sentence she had rehearsed. "Preston is waiting for me downstairs," she said. "A man who moves cargo across a river can't give me the future I deserve, Rowan. You never could." Rowan looked at her for a long time. He thought about those 5 dates in November and December. He thought about how she had waited for his text. Then he picked up the pen. Rennie Doyle had waited 3 years, and he wasn't in any hurry. 3 years earlier, he had used a refrigerated shipping container at Pier C to move something the enamel sign on the steel post forbade anyone from moving. He thought it was a small matter. He thought that in a port stretching 23 kilometers, no one counted every crate. He was wrong in the same way so many men before him had been wrong. Rowan Castellani didn't pound the table, and he didn't swear. He came to see Doyle in the Pier C office one August afternoon, closed the door, and told him in a voice half a beat lower than usual that he had 48 hours to leave the river and never return. Doyle lost his contract, lost his access credentials, and lost the minor position he had spent 10 years climbing toward. He lost nothing more than that. That was exactly why he couldn't forget it. For 3 years, he took smaller and smaller jobs around Port Richmond, and he listened. He didn't need much. He only needed one evening when that man went somewhere alone. That almost never happened. Rowan always had Beau Kinnard with him, and when Beau wasn't there were 2 other men, and when no one was available, Rowan didn't go out. But there were nights when a man wanted to be alone, and Doyle knew the day of the divorce would be one of those nights because, 3 weeks earlier, he had paid a court clerk to tell him exactly when it would happen. Rowan ate dinner alone at a small restaurant on Passyunk Street, where his father had once taken him when he was 11 years old. He ordered what he always ordered. He didn't speak to anyone. Beau waited in the car 1 block away because Rowan had told him to wait there, and Beau had argued twice, and Rowan had said no twice. The rain was still falling when Rowan stepped outside. It was the same March rain that had soaked his shoulders on the steps of the Market Avenue building 11 hours earlier. He stopped beneath the awning to turn up his collar, and he thought about the ring he had left on the walnut table. And he thought that he would have to tell Gus in the morning, and he thought that Gus wouldn't say anything at all but would simply hand him the second cup of coffee. 2 short, sharp cracks, almost entirely swallowed by the rain hammering against the metal roof. The sidewalk tilted beneath him. Rowan didn't remember falling. He remembered the wet pavement very close to his eyes, and the red glow from the restaurant sign bleeding through the water. He remembered thinking, with extraordinary calm and complete absurdity, that there would be no saving this wool coat now. He remembered tires screeching somewhere far away, then running footsteps, then Beau Kennard calling his name twice, 3 times, each time louder than the last. Beau dragged him into the back seat, slammed the door, climbed behind the wheel, and dialed Yusuf Amari. Amari had been the organization's private physician for 14 years. He had a private clinic in Bala Sinwid, with a back room that never appeared in any official record. He had only one rule, and that rule was that he always answered the phone. It rang 8 times. No one answered. Beau called again. He put the phone on speaker, placed it on his thigh, drove with both hands, and listened to 8 more rings fill the car. No one answered. Later, much later, after everything was over and Beau Kennard was finally able to sleep again, he would tell Rowan that the worst part of that entire night wasn't the gunfire. It was those 16 rings, because Beau had called that number 7 times in 7 years, and every single time Amari had answered before the 3rd ring. 4 minutes later, Rowan stopped responding when Beau called his name. Beau looked up at the road signs at the intersection of Broad Avenue. To the right was the road toward the clinic in Bala Sinwid, 22 minutes if traffic was clear. And traffic wasn't clear, and the man at the other end of the line wasn't answering. To the left was a green sign, with an arrow and a 4-letter hospital abbreviation he had never seen before, on the edge of Kensington, 4 minutes away. Beau Kennard was a man who had once spent 90 days inside a room in New Jersey 7 years earlier, because Rowan Castellani had paid for that room and had never mentioned it again. He knew every rule of the organization. He knew a public hospital meant records, police, and a numbered report no one could erase. He turned the wheel sharply to the left. It was the most important decision Beau Kennard had ever made, and he made it in 1.5 seconds. The automatic glass doors of St. Brigid opened at 10:47 that night, and Maren Voss was the first person to touch him. She was 4 steps away when the car stopped outside the entrance, and a broad-shouldered man dragged another man from the back seat without waiting for anyone to help. There was no ambulance, no advance call, nothing at all. Maren had worked in that department for 4 years, and she knew that walk, the walk of someone carrying something in his arms that he knew he was about to drop. She pushed the gurney from Corridor B toward them. The crooked wheel squeaked in rhythm as it crossed the strip of flooring between the 2 sections. She didn't hear it then, and she wouldn't remember hearing it until many months later. Both of her hands pressed down beneath the left side of his rib cage and remained there for 11 minutes. Not 10 minutes, not 15. She knew exactly because the clock on the opposite wall had a second hand, and she had looked at it 3 times, and because in this profession, time was the only thing anyone truly counted. She didn't lift her hands for even a second. Not when Dr. Naomi Strand came running. Not when they pushed the gurney through 2 sets of doors and into the elevator. Not even when someone told her she could let go now. She followed the gurney all the way to the operating room doors with both hands still in the same position, and she released them only when the anesthesia team placed their hands where hers had been. During those 11 minutes, Maren noticed 3 things no one else in the room noticed. The first was that this man, during the brief time he was still able to speak, didn't ask whether he was going to live. People always asked that question. In 4 years, she had never encountered an exception. He gripped the sleeve at her wrist, pulled her closer, and asked who was guarding the door. The second was that 4 men in black coats stood in the hallway, and throughout the next 4 hours, not one of them sat down. The waiting area at St. Brigid had 14 seats, and only 6 were occupied that night. The other 4 men remained standing, spaced evenly apart, each facing a different direction. The third was that when she searched the pockets of his soaking wet black wool coat for identification, she found nothing. No insurance card, no driver's license, no bank card, 1 powered-off phone, and $300 in cash folded in half. In 4 years, she had searched the pockets of homeless people, drunken people, and people who had just been beaten and robbed, and every one of them had carried more identification than this man. The surgery lasted 3 hours and 10 minutes. When he was transferred to recovery, 2 of the 4 men in black began walking down the hallway toward the door. Maren stepped in front of it. She stood just over 5 feet 3 inches tall, weighed less than 110 pounds, and had been working for 19 hours straight. She didn't raise her voice. "You can stand in the hallway, or I'll call security," she said. "In this room, I decide who stays." The broad-shouldered man who had pulled him from the car looked at her. He said nothing. He looked through the square window in the door at the bed inside, where the man had emerged from the anesthesia, just enough to open his eyes. Rowan nodded once. The 2 men in black stepped back into the hallway and remained standing. They didn't sit down. The Philadelphia police had been waiting in the hallway since midnight. At 2:15 in the morning, as soon as the anesthesia wore off, 2 officers entered the room with their notebooks open. They asked Rowan what had happened. In the hoarse voice of a man whose breathing tube had just been removed, he told them he had been robbed on Passyunk Street, that it had been raining, and that he hadn't seen anyone clearly. Then they turned to Maren in the hallway and opened a notebook, and these were the 30 seconds she would think about for many months afterward. She gave them the time the patient had arrived, 10:47. She gave them his vital signs upon admission. She gave them the location of his injuries, the estimated amount of blood loss, and the time he had been transferred to the operating room. She told them that the person who brought him in was a man whose name she didn't know and whom she hadn't seen again afterward. Every word she said was true. She didn't mention the 4 men in the hallway. She didn't mention that there had been no identification in his coat. She didn't mention the first question he had asked her. No one asked her about those things, so she didn't lie. She didn't help them either. The female officer closed her notebook, thanked her, and told her she should go home and get some sleep. Maren said she still had 2 hours left in her shift. He remained at St. Bridget for 7 nights, and during those 7 nights, Maren Voss didn't ask him what he did for a living even once. It wasn't discretion. It was habit in an emergency department on the edge of Kensington, where the question, "What do you do for a living?" rarely led anywhere good and usually made people lie. And a nurse didn't need a lie. She needed a blood pressure reading. She entered his name on the tracking board as the patient in bed 7. She checked his vital signs every 4 hours. She changed his dressings, made her notes, and asked nothing, and he said nothing. And both of them found the arrangement comfortable, in a way neither of them wanted to examine too closely. On the 4th night, she told him about Teddy, not because she trusted him, because she had been working for 18 hours and was sitting in the plastic chair beside his bed finishing his chart. And he asked how many hours she slept, and she said, 4. Then she was quiet for a moment, and added that her younger brother was 19 years old and lived in a care facility in Bensalem, room 214, and that she went there on Sunday mornings. She said the amount, $4,100 a month, in the way people say a number they have repeated in their minds so many times that it has stopped meaning anything. Then she stood up, apologized for rambling, and walked out. Rowan said nothing. He knew she didn't sleep 4 hours. He had counted the number of times she passed his doorway during the night, and he knew that a person who slept 4 hours moved differently. On the 5th morning, a light rain was falling. Outside the hospital room window was a stretch of sidewalk, and a puddle gathered where the pavement had sunk, and 2 children in yellow raincoats walked past on their way to school with an adult following behind them. The younger child stopped, studied the puddle for 1 second, then stepped into the middle of it with both feet, entirely on purpose. The older child burst out laughing and jumped in after him. The adult behind them said something, and both children ran, still laughing. Maren was hanging a bag of intravenous fluid. She watched them for 3 seconds, then returned to her work. Rowan watched her looking out the window, and he took note of those 3 seconds, and he didn't understand why he had taken note of them. On the 5th night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Marvin Otley was brought to bed 11. Rowan heard everything through the partition. The old man wasn't seriously ill. He was only cold and hungry, and had nowhere to sit until morning. Maren brought him a carton of porridge from the staff cafeteria, sat on the edge of the bed, and fed him 1 spoonful at a time for 15 minutes, because his hands shook too badly to hold the spoon. She asked him about the knitted hat he was wearing. He told her a long story with no beginning and no ending. She listened to all of it. No one paid her for those 15 minutes. There wasn't a single line in the medical chart recording them. No one saw it except a man in bed 7 who was pretending to sleep. Something inside Rowan Castellani rearranged itself at 3:15 that morning, and he had no name for it. On the 6th night, he developed a fever. His temperature climbed to nearly 104 degrees, around 2 o'clock in the morning. Marin called the physician on duty, changed his antibiotics, and applied cool compresses. He drifted in and out for about 40 minutes, speaking in broken fragments, in the shattered language of someone burning with fever. She had heard hundreds of people talk in delirium. People called for their mothers, called for their wives, called names no one else recognized. Rowan called one name, Teddy. He said it twice. The second time, it was followed by something that sounded like an apology. Marin froze in the middle of the room with a wet cloth in her hand. She stood that way longer than she would ever want to admit. Then she placed the cloth on his forehead and continued doing her work until the fever broke close to 5 o'clock. The next morning, he woke with a clear mind and stable vital signs. She checked his blood pressure, wrote it on the chart, and then she asked, "Last night, you called a name. Teddy." Rowan looked at her. There was a very brief silence that she would later reconstruct in her mind dozens of times, and still wouldn't be able to decipher. "I don't know anyone by that name," he said. He was telling the truth. Marin nodded, closed the chart, and left the room. She walked the length of corridor B with the squeak of the crooked gurney wheel sounding behind someone farther down the hall, and she told herself that people said all kinds of things when they were burning with fever, that Teddy was a common name, that there were thousands of people named Teddy in that city. She told herself that for 4 months. He was discharged on the morning of the 8th day, during a shift when Marin wasn't working. She learned about it when she arrived at 7 o'clock that evening, and found that the sheets on bed 7 had been changed, and another patient was lying there. There was no message, nothing at all. Ruthie Bascom said he had signed himself out at 9 o'clock that morning, 3 days earlier than recommended, and that 4 men had accompanied him all the way to the entrance. Marin nodded, picked up the chart for bed 11, and didn't give it another thought. She thought about it 3 days later, when the envelope from Brookhaven Care arrived. She opened it in the stairwell of her building because she always opened her mail in the stairwell, and she read the first line 3 times before she understood what it said. The account of patient Theodore Voss, room 214, had been paid in full for 12 months beginning April 1st. There was no remaining balance. No further action was required. Beneath that was a smaller line, stating that the person who had made the payment had requested that their identity remain confidential under the facility's privacy policy. $4,100 multiplied by 12. Marin sat down on the 9th step and did the calculation 3 times in her head, even though she had known the answer the first time. There was something else inside the envelope. A ballpoint pen, cheap plastic, blue ink, a white barrel printed with the words, St. Bridget Hospital, faded along one side from being washed so many times. There was no letter, no business card, not a single word. She recognized it immediately. She had slipped it into the pocket of her lab coat that night, and it had fallen out somewhere between the automatic glass doors and the operating room, and she hadn't given it another second of thought because she lost pens every week, and because there had been too many other things to think about that night. Someone had picked it up. Someone had kept it. Someone had placed it inside an envelope with confirmation that $49,200 had been paid, and hadn't written a single word. That was how a man who didn't know how to say thank you said thank you. It took Marin 2 days to discover who he was. It wasn't very difficult. 4 men in black coats, no identification, an expensive car stopping outside the emergency entrance, and a name that sounded Italian. She searched online and found a company called Castellani Cold Storage and Freight, and an address on the Delaware River waterfront. And she read 4 articles, and not one of them answered the question she was truly asking. She drove to Pier A on Friday afternoon before her night shift, still dressed in her work clothes. She didn't bring a check. She didn't have $49,200 and never would. What she brought was her refusal. She was led into an office on the 2nd floor of Cold Storage Warehouse 1, a room with windows overlooking the river, and a desk with nothing on it except 2 stacks of files. Rowan Castellani stood when she entered. He was thinner than he had been 8 days earlier, and he stood like a man trying to keep the left side of his body from having to do any work. "I can't accept it," Marin said. He didn't answer. "I don't know who you are," she continued. "I can guess, but I don't know. What I do know is that money like this is never free. I grew up in a neighborhood where someone would occasionally bring money to a family that was drowning, and everyone would be happy for about 3 months. and then the price would come due. I've been poor long enough to know the price always comes later. Rowan Castellani had sat in rooms with federal attorneys. He had stood before men who wanted him dead. In 12 years, he had never entered a conversation without already knowing the first 3 sentences he intended to say. He had no prepared answer for this one, so he told her the truth. "You kept your hands on me for 11 minutes, he said. "You didn't know my name. You didn't know whether I had money. You didn't know who I was, and you didn't ask. No one has done that for me since my father died." Marin looked at him. "That isn't a reason for me to accept your money," she said. "I know," he said. She still refused. She made that clear twice more, and he didn't argue with her even once. But she didn't leave. She sat down in the chair across from him and stayed for another 40 minutes, talking about the river, about the 3 cold storage warehouses, and about why a person would keep a pen he had picked up from the floor of a car. By the time she left, the sun had dropped below the water pipes on the opposite shore. She placed the pen firmly on his desk, turned, and walked out. Preston Halloran learned that Rowan Castellani had survived on the 3rd morning after that rainy night on Passyunk Street, and he sat motionless in his office on the 26th floor for 40 minutes, recalculating everything. He hadn't ordered the shooting. That was the truth. And it was also the only thing in this entire story he could say without lying. But when he heard the news, his first reaction wasn't surprise. It was regret. And a man who realizes that his first reaction is regret has already passed through a door he can't walk back through, so he changed his strategy. When a man died, his records became frozen into his legacy. The courts examined every page, and everything Halloran had constructed over 11 months would be laid bare beneath the light. When a man remained alive, but lost all credibility, no one examined anything. People simply nodded and said they had always suspected. He would no longer kill Rowan Castellani. He would destroy him. The first article appeared in the Inquirer 9 days later. It didn't accuse anyone of anything. It merely stated that, according to 2 unnamed sources, federal agencies were examining the flow of money through several logistics companies along the Delaware River waterfront, and that Castellani Cold Storage and Freight was among them. 3 paragraphs. There was no comment from the company, because no one had called to request one. 3 days later, customs officers came down to the docks. They opened 84 containers over 4 days and found nothing. And the fact that they found nothing wasn't reported anywhere. Within 10 days, 3 major contracts withdrew: a food company in Baltimore, a pharmaceutical distributor in New Jersey, and a client who had first signed with Silvio Castellani in 1996 and hadn't missed a single renewal in 28 years. The representative called Rowan to apologize. He said his board couldn't accept the reputational risk at that time. He said he was deeply sorry. He cried at the end of the call. Rowan thanked him, ended the call, and told no one about it. Then Sloane went on television. The interview aired during the 6 o'clock news on Thursday evening and was replayed Friday morning. She sat in a gray upholstered chair inside a softly lit room, her platinum blonde hair cut into a perfect bob, wearing exactly 2 pieces of jewelry. She didn't cry. That was the detail that made it effective. "I gave him everything," she said. "And all that time, he was hiding something from me that could have changed everything." The host asked whether she could be more specific. And she was. She said he woke at 4 o'clock in the morning and left the house before she was awake. True. She said he never talked about his work, not once, in 7 years. True. She said there was a safe in his study, and she didn't have the code. True. She said he paid cash for things that should have been paid for by card. True. She said there were nights when he came home at 2 o'clock in the morning and didn't offer a single word of explanation. True. She said that when she asked what he was thinking, he remained silent, and that silence lasted for 7 years. Every detail she gave was accurate when isolated from everything around it. Not one sentence could be challenged. Not one sentence was false, and every detail had been framed to turn the same man into a different man. His discipline became coldness. His caution became deceit. His refusal to bring his burdens home became proof that he didn't trust his wife. And his silence, the thing a man had used all his life to protect the people around him from things they didn't need to know, became guilt. This was a more powerful blow than any document Halloran possessed. Documents could be challenged, but this couldn't. It had been spoken by the woman who had truly lived inside that house. It had been spoken by the only person with the authority to say it. Within 24 hours, 4 million people across Pennsylvania had formed an opinion about Rowan Castellani, and not one of them had ever met him. He watched the replay on his phone at 6 o'clock Friday morning, standing alone at Pier A beside a stack of pallets, a cup of cold black coffee in his other hand. Mist was rising from the river exactly as it always did. He watched all 4 minutes and 10 seconds. He didn't skip ahead. He didn't watch it again. Then he slipped the phone into his coat pocket, set the coffee on the stack of pallets, and went back to work. Naomi Strand called Marin into her office at 7:20 in the morning, just as the night shift had ended, and that was the first detail that told Marin this wasn't a small matter. The head of the emergency department didn't call anyone in at 7:20 unless she had been sitting with the problem all night. There was a printout on the desk, 3 pages. The access log from the department's automated medication cabinet, covering 6 weeks. 3 opioid withdrawals had been recorded without corresponding orders in any patient's chart. March 12th, March 26th, and April 9th. All 3 had been made under Marin Voss's login credentials. All 3 had occurred during shifts when she was present in the department. Naomi Strand didn't accuse her. She simply pushed the pages across the desk and asked whether Marin could explain them. Marin stared at those 3 lines longer than necessary. She knew with absolute certainty, without even 1% of doubt, that she hadn't done it. She knew it the way a person knows she didn't set fire to her own home. But knowing was one thing, and saying it aloud was another, because the only sentence she could offer was, "I didn't do it." And the medical profession had heard that sentence for 20 years from a great many people who had. There was a second sentence she could have said. She knew exactly where it was waiting inside her mouth. She felt it there for a long silence. She didn't say it. Naomi Strand waited. She was a good physician, and she had defended Marin before the personnel board twice in 4 years, and she was giving Marin a very wide space to step into. Marin said she couldn't explain it. Dr. Strand folded the paper and said she was sorry, and that the decision wasn't hers. Suspension without pay, effective immediately, pending an investigation by the Pennsylvania Board of Nursing. Her access badge would be taken. Her login credentials would be locked. She said the process usually lasted between 90 and 180 days. She said Marin should find an attorney. Then she added that if Marin needed a letter addressing her professional competence, she would write one, and she would write exactly what she truly believed. Marin thanked her, surrendered her badge, and walked out to the employee parking lot, still wearing her uniform, without pay. Those were the only 2 words left in her mind when she sat down in her car. 3 days later, the second envelope from Brookhaven Care arrived. She opened it in the stairwell, in the exact place where she had been sitting when she opened the first envelope. The letter stated that because of an adjustment to the billing record of patient Theodore Voss, the 12-month advance payment had been returned to the payer upon request, and the account was now past due. If payment wasn't received within 30 days, the patient would be transferred to the state long-term care facility in Norristown under the standard transition process. Marin read that line 4 times. She had refused that money on the 2nd floor of Cold Storage Warehouse 1 at Pier A, and the man had respected her refusal, and that was exactly what she had asked him to do. And now the consequence lay before her on a white sheet of paper. She couldn't blame him. That was the worst part. She had stood in that room and told him that money like that was never free, and he had nodded, and he had done exactly what she told him to do. Norristown was a 70-minute drive from Bensalem when traffic was clear. Traffic was never clear on Sunday mornings. She drove to Brookhaven that afternoon. She didn't go inside. She parked in the corner of the lot, where she could see the row of 2nd-floor windows, counted to the 7th window from the left, and sat there. 40 minutes, without starting the engine. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since she was 15, and she had no intention of beginning again in a parking lot. She only looked at the 7th window and worked through the only calculation left to make, $3,800 in her account. No income beginning today. No possibility of applying for work at another hospital while she was under investigation, because the second question on any application would be about the status of her nursing license. 30 days, $4,100. She sat with those numbers until the maple trees along the edge of the parking lot changed into the color of late afternoon. Then she started the car and drove home to prepare for a night shift. She was no longer permitted to work. The second sentence, Marin Voss hadn't spoken in Naomi Strand's office, was a name, and that name was Ruthie Bascom. She had known for 14 months. It happened one afternoon in May of the previous year, when Marin covered an administrative shift for a nurse who had called in sick and had to reconcile the medication cabinet inventory at the end of the month. She opened the access log, filtered it by her own code because hers was the first entry on the list, and found a number that didn't match. There had been a medication withdrawal at 4:15 in the morning on the 23rd, recorded under her code. During a shift, she remembered clearly because that night she had spent 40 minutes sitting with a woman whose husband had just died and hadn't gone near the medication cabinet even once. She stared at the line for about 10 seconds. Then she checked who else had been in the department at 4:15 that morning, and the list was very short, and the first name on it was Ruthie Bascom. Ruthie had a 26-year-old son. She didn't hide that fact. She spoke of him the way people spoke of a storm that had passed through their home 3 times and might not have truly moved on. She had taken him to treatment 4 times in 6 years, and the 4th time, she had sold her car. Maren sat in front of the screen for a very long time. Then she closed the browser window. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't open that log again even once during the next 14 months. And that was precisely why her code had been chosen, because in the entire St. Bridget emergency department, Maren Voss was the only person who never checked the access records, and a desperate woman was very good at recognizing the person who wouldn't look. Maren told herself it wasn't her concern. She told herself Ruthie had been a nurse for 29 years. She told herself that if she reported it, a 52-year-old woman would lose everything in a single afternoon, and a 26-year-old man would lose the last thing still holding him back. She told herself all those things, and every one of them was partly true, and even taken together, they still didn't become a reason. So when Naomi Strand pushed those 3 pages across the desk and asked whether she could explain them, Maren couldn't explain them. Not because she didn't know, because she couldn't accuse Ruthie Bascom without admitting that she had known for 14 months, and that admission would destroy her faster than the 3 medication withdrawals ever could. 3 weeks passed. Ruthie remained silent. Maren remained silent. The 2 women shared something neither of them dared to name, and one of them was sitting at home without pay, with $3,800 and 27 days left. On the 22nd day, Maren returned to St. Bridget to collect the belongings from her locker. She stood in the staff break room and called Brookhaven to ask about the transfer procedure. She asked whether the facility in Norristown allowed visitors on Sundays. She asked whether they permitted newspapers to be brought into patients' rooms. She asked in the calm voice of someone who had stopped hoping and moved on to making arrangements. Ruthie Bascom stood in the doorway of the break room and listened to the entire call. The following day, she submitted a 2-page handwritten statement to Naomi Strand. She listed all 3 dates, all 3 times, and all 3 medications. She explained exactly how she had obtained Maren Voss's login code and how long she had been using it. She stated clearly that Maren Voss knew nothing about it. That was the only sentence in the entire statement that wasn't completely true, and Ruthie Bascom wrote it deliberately. She resigned that same day. The Pennsylvania Board of Nursing revoked her license after 29 years of practice. She lost her professional pension, lost her health insurance, and lost the right to call herself a nurse, a right she had held since she was 23 years old. She traded the final 2 years of her career for room 214 and a 19-year-old boy she had never met even once. 4 days later, the board dismissed every allegation against Maren Voss and entered 3 words into her record that every nurse wanted to see, and very few ever did. No basis found. Her license was restored without restriction. Dr. Strand called to give her the news, and her voice sounded noticeably lighter. Maren thanked her, ended the call, and sat down on the edge of the bed in her apartment. She had been exonerated. Her record was clean. On paper, she was entirely innocent, and she always would be. And she would never be able to say that she had been blameless. She knew it, and she would carry it with her, and no one else in the world would ever know it existed. The 3rd envelope didn't arrive by mail. Maren found it at 9 o'clock on Tuesday night, lying beneath the door of her 3rd-floor apartment in a building on Thompson Street, pushed so far inside that half of it rested beneath the doormat. It was a large yellow envelope, the kind used for documents. No stamp, no postmark, no return address. On the front was only her name, printed in a standard typeface. It was Preston Halloran's final leverage. Having bought the records from Dr. Amari, he didn't send them to the police, he sent them to the one person whose heartbreak could destroy Rowan Castellani from the inside out. She carried it into the kitchen and stood beside the table to open it, because, at that moment, she still believed it was something a person could open while standing. There was no letter enclosed, not a single line of explanation, no threat, no price demanded. There were only 27 pages of documents arranged in chronological order by someone who knew exactly which sequence would cause the greatest pain. The first page was a copy of a traffic accident report from the Philadelphia Police Department, dated September 14, 2023. The intersection of Aramingo Avenue and Cambria Street, 11:20 at night. A 19-year-old male motorcyclist named Theodore Voss. Maren knew that page. She had read it until she knew it by heart during those first weeks when Teddy was still in intensive care, and she still believed that if she read closely enough, she would find some detail that could save him. The second page was the same report, bearing the same case number and the same date, and it was different. The copy she had kept for the past 3 years stated that the second vehicle couldn't be identified, that there had been no witnesses, and that no surveillance footage existed because of a system failure in the area. The copy inside the envelope, the original version, the version that hadn't been altered, listed the license plate clearly. It identified the type of vehicle, an 18-wheeler refrigerated truck, and it named the registered owner, Castellani Cold Storage and Freight. Maren sat down, not in a chair. She lowered herself onto the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinet beneath the sink, with 27 pages resting across her lap. She kept turning them. The driver's name was Emmett Rusk, 47 years old, holding a valid commercial license, and he had been working for 14 consecutive hours when the collision occurred. He didn't stop. He drove another 2.5 miles, then parked in an empty lot on Castor Street and called a number that wasn't an emergency line. There was an initial interview report. There was a witness statement from Hoa Dang, the owner of an auto repair shop on the corner, who had seen the truck and remembered the final 3 digits of its license plate. That statement appeared in the original report and was absent from the altered one. There was a case transfer form dated September 21st, 7 days after the accident, signed by an officer whose name had been blacked out in this copy. And there was Emmett Rusk's employment record. His contract in Philadelphia had been terminated on September 23rd. He had been rehired by a logistics company in Columbus, Ohio, on September 23rd, the same day. 9 days after her brother had fallen onto the pavement on Aramingo Avenue. Maren read every page. She didn't skip a single one. She read them the way she read medical charts, from top to bottom without jumping ahead, because 4 years in the emergency department had taught her that the most important thing was always hidden where no one expected to find it. The final page wasn't a police report. It was a transfer receipt. An organization called the Delaware Valley Medical Expense Assistance Fund, established in October of 2023 and dissolved in July of 2025. 31 transfers into the long-term care account of patient Theodore Voss at Brookhaven Care in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. Maren knew those payments. During the second month, she had called Brookhaven to ask why her bill was lower than expected, and an administrator had told her there was a state assistance program for injuries caused by traffic accidents, and that her brother's case qualified. She had thanked that person 3 times. She had put down the phone, sat in her car, and breathed freely for the first time in weeks. She had told 2 friends about it. She had called it the only piece of good fortune in the entire tragedy. It wasn't state assistance. It wasn't an administrative blessing. It was settlement money routed through a shell organization created 3 weeks after the accident and closed once it had finished doing what it was created to do. For 3 years, Maren Voss had been paid to remain silent about what had happened to her brother, and she hadn't even known she was being paid. She had thanked people for it. That was the detail that would remain with her the longest. Not the altered report, not Emmett Rusk in Columbus, not the 9 days. It was the fact that she had sat in her car in the Brookhaven parking lot one afternoon, in November of 2023, and felt grateful. Maren sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet. She remained there until morning. That same week, 18.5 miles from the waterfront, Rowan Castellani finally discovered the source of the leak, and he didn't find it through any document. He found it through Beau Kennard. Beau hadn't slept well since that night in March. He still drove, still arrived at 5 o'clock in the morning, still did everything the way he always had, but something had worked its way inside him and refused to leave. He mentioned it 3 times over 6 weeks, a little more each time, the way people press against a wound to see whether it still hurts. 16 rings. He said the number aloud one afternoon inside cold storage warehouse, 2 while the 2 of them were inspecting the cooling system, and this time Rowan stopped. 7 times in 7 years, Beau said. 7 times I called that number, and he answered before the 3rd ring. Every single time. I remember because I counted without meaning to count. Rowan stood between two rows of shelving with cold vapor rising around his feet, and he thought about a man who had served as the organization's private physician for 14 years and had lived by one rule throughout all 14 of them. It took him 9 days to reconstruct everything else. Yusuf Amari had treated Emmett Rusk in the early hours of September 15th, 2023. A deep laceration across the back of his right hand and 2 fractured metacarpal bones, the kind of injuries a man suffered when he struck his own steering wheel with his fist. Amari stitched the wound, set the bones, and entered nothing into any official record, because that was the work he had been paid to do. But he kept a copy. Not a copy of the medical file. A copy of everything. The patient's name, the time, his condition, who brought him in, who paid, and 4 lines of handwritten notes Amari had carefully written that night while waiting for the anesthetic to take effect. He stored it in a safe deposit box at a bank in Wynwood and called it insurance. Preston Halloran bought it for $400,000, 10 weeks before that rainy night on Passyunk Street, and that was the answer. That was why a phone had rung 8 times, and then 8 more inside a car racing toward Broad Avenue, and no one had answered. Yusuf Amari hadn't wanted to be part of the scene. If Rowan Castellani died that night, there would be an investigation, and the investigation would ask who had received the final call, and Amari had calculated that the best name to keep off that list was his own. He had already chosen a side. He simply didn't want to be there to watch. Rowan waited for him in the parking lot behind his private clinic in Bala Sinwid at 7 o'clock on Thursday evening. He came alone. He told Bo to wait on the street, and Bo argued once, and Rowan said no once. Amari saw him and stopped between 2 rows of cars. He was 55 years old and wore rimless glasses, and the hand holding his keys began to tremble almost imperceptibly. Rowan didn't move any closer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lower it. He asked only one question. "Did you know about the 19-year-old boy?" Amari opened his mouth. Then he closed it again. He stood there in the parking lot with his keys in his hand and couldn't find a single sentence to say, and both men understood that his silence was the answer. Rowan nodded once, turned away, and walked out. He didn't touch him. He didn't say another word. In 12 years, he had learned that a frightened man lied, but a man forced to look directly at what he had done would eventually confess. Rowan needed testimony. He didn't need revenge, and he hadn't needed it since that foggy morning on Pier A when Gus Ferraro asked him how he wanted the matter handled. But when he climbed into the back seat and Bo drove out of the parking lot, Rowan said nothing for 20 minutes, because he had just learned something worse than Amari's betrayal. The settlement in 2023 was real. A truck bearing his company's name had caused it. One of his drivers had fled. A police report had been altered. A witness had been erased from the file. A man had been moved to another state within 9 days, and a shell fund had been created to pay money to a family. Every part of it bore his name, and Rowan Castellani hadn't known any of it existed. She arrived at Pier A at 10 o'clock that night. The gatekeeper didn't want to let her in. She gave him her name and said she was a nurse at St. Brigid, and that if he didn't call upstairs, she would stand there until morning, and there was something in her voice that made him pick up the radio. Rowan came down to meet her on the ground floor of Cold Storage Warehouse 1, beneath fluorescent lights and surrounded by the smell of cold metal. He didn't have time to say a single word. She threw the envelope at his chest. His hands came up instinctively to catch it, and when they did, the ballpoint pen in the left pocket of his coat slipped out and fell onto the concrete floor. It bounced once, rolled halfway around, and stopped between them. A white plastic barrel, blue ink. The words St. Brigid Hospital faded along one side. They both looked at it. Marin had given it back. She had placed it on the desk upstairs that afternoon when she came to refuse the money, and she had assumed he would throw it away. He had kept it for every single day since that night. In the left pocket of his coat, directly above the place where the scar lay. That was the only reason Marin Voss didn't turn around and walk away during the next 3 seconds. "Read it," she said. Rowan opened the envelope where he stood. He read all 27 pages on his feet beneath the fluorescent lights, without skipping a single one. She watched his face the entire time, and she had worked in medicine long enough to know what was an act and what wasn't. By page 14, his hands were no longer holding the papers the way they had before. When he finished, he didn't speak immediately. He folded the documents carefully along their original creases. "I didn't know," he said. Then he added, before she could open her mouth, "And I know that doesn't matter." He didn't offer a single excuse. He didn't say that he had been in Sicily when it happened, even though he had been there, even though he had buried his mother that week. He didn't say he would find out who had done it. He simply stood there with 27 pages in his hands and accepted their full weight. Maren looked at him and said the thing that had been taking shape inside her mind throughout the 36 hours she had spent sitting on her kitchen floor. "You think silence is protection," she said. "You think that if you don't say anything, no one gets pulled into it. It isn't. Silence is how you hide from having to stand in front of another person and tell them who you are. You were silent with your wife for 7 years. You were silent with me for 7 nights in the hospital. And somewhere inside your silence, a man altered a police report without you ever knowing, because you built an entire world where no one had to tell you anything." Rowan didn't argue with a single word. He set the documents on a wooden crate and told her everything. His full name, his father's name, the organization his father had left him when he was 22 years old, and that he had been given no choice to refuse. 30 years of rules, what he controlled along 23 kilometers of waterfront, and what he had done to hold it together. He didn't soften it. He didn't claim to be a good man. He named 3 specific things he had ordered during those 12 years and couldn't take back. And he spoke of them in the same steady voice he used when discussing Pier C losing money for the 11th consecutive month. He lifted his shirt and showed her the scar running along his left ribs, the scar that had been there before the 2 bullet wounds in March. And he told her what year it happened, who had caused it, and why. Then he told her about Theodore, his younger brother, 4 years younger than Rowan, dead at 21. Rowan had found him one February morning in his apartment on Reed Street. He didn't describe anything more. He only said that sentence and stopped, and Maren didn't ask. He said he hadn't told anyone about it in 15 years. Not Sloane, not Gus, even though Gus had been there that day. Not a single person. He said his father had hung the enamel sign on the steel post outside Warehouse 1 the following spring, and 30 years later it was still there. And in all those 30 years no one had broken that rule, and now she knew why. And finally, he told her that Theodore was the name he had called during his fever on the 6th night in bed 7. Not her brother. His. Maren listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt him once. She stood beneath the fluorescent lights inside Cold Storage Warehouse 1 and listened as a man dismantled himself 1 brick at a time, and she didn't say a word until he had finished. Then she picked up the pen from the concrete floor, placed it in his hand, and went home. Gus Ferraro collapsed in the Pier C office on Tuesday afternoon of the following week, at 3:45, while he was reconciling the electricity costs for the 3 cold storage warehouses. The person who found him was a 24-year-old accountant named Priya, who panicked for exactly 4 seconds before remembering the number she needed to call. The ambulance arrived within 7 minutes. He survived. That was the first thing the doctor told Rowan in the 3rd-floor hallway. And she said it in the way people spoke when the second half of the sentence would carry more weight than the first. He had survived, but the part of his brain responsible for language was no longer intact. He could hear. He could see. He could gently squeeze another person's hand. He would never speak again. Rowan sat beside his bed for 2 hours that night and said nothing, because both men belonged to a world where silence was their native language. And because for the first time in 40 years, Gus Ferraro couldn't call him boy. 3 days later, Rowan returned to the Pier C office to retrieve the insurance records. Gus's desk was an old steel model from the 70s that he had refused to replace, even though Rowan had offered 3 times. The top drawer contained pens, paper clips, and a pack of cigarettes. He had quit smoking in 2011, but had kept for reasons of his own. The second drawer held notebooks and invoices. The bottom drawer was stuck. Rowan had to pull hard twice. Inside was a brown envelope lying face down, and across the front was a handwritten line in blue ballpoint ink, written in the rigid, slanting hand of a man who had learned to write in the 60s, for the boy, when he is angry enough to read it. Rowan stood in that room for a very long time before opening it. Inside were 4 typed pages, each signed at the bottom, with a notary seal on the final page. It was a complete confession. Gus Ferraro stated that on the night of September 14th, 2023, he received a call from the driver, Emmett Rusk, at 11:37. He stated that he had gone alone to the empty lot on Castor Street. He stated the exact amount he had paid a police officer to have the report rewritten, and the testimony of an auto repair shop owner named Hoa Deng removed from the file. He stated that he had called Yusuf Amari at 1 o'clock in the morning and taken Rusk to Bala Sinwid. He stated that he had arranged a job for Rusk in Columbus and put him on a bus on September 23rd. He stated that he had established the Delaware Valley Medical Expense Assistance Fund on October 6th, with 31 transfers scheduled in advance to the account of patient Theodore Voss at Brookhaven Care, and that he had chosen the name because it sounded like a state program. And in the final paragraph, he wrote that Rowan Castellani had been in Sicily throughout that entire period, making arrangements for his mother's funeral, that Rowan Castellani hadn't been informed, hadn't been consulted, and hadn't known anything about any of it. He wrote that he had made the decision alone at 12:20 in the morning on September 15th, and that he had made it because he believed it was what Silvio would have done. The date on the document was September 14th, 2023. Rowan read that date 3 times, the very day Gus had done it. Gus Ferraro had written his own sentence on the same night he committed the crime. He had typed it, signed it, taken it to be notarized, and placed it in the bottom drawer of an old steel desk. Then he had lived with it for 3 years. 3 years standing on Pier A at 4 o'clock in the morning with 2 cups of coffee. 3 years asking about Pier C every month even though he already knew the answer. 3 years calling a 40-year-old man-boy, while knowing that inside his drawer was something that would destroy both of them on the day it was opened. He hadn't kept it to protect himself. Had he wanted to protect himself, he would have destroyed it. He had kept it so that someday, if everything came apart, Rowan would have something clean to place before the court. A signed and notarized statement bearing the correct date, and making it clear that the man in the highest chair had known nothing. In the medical records the hospital gave Rowan 3 days later, there was a single note from the cardiologist. The patient hadn't taken his prescribed anticoagulant medication during the previous 3 weeks. Rowan counted backward 3 weeks. It was exactly the week he had begun investigating Yusuf Amari. Gus had known. He knew that once Rowan traced the path to Amari, he would eventually trace it to the drawer, and he knew how long that would take, and he had calculated correctly. He simply hadn't wanted to be there when the boy read it. The Delaware River Port Authority Committee met on Monday morning to consider renewing Castellani Cold Storage and Freight's 30-year dock lease, and Rowan Castellani sat in the second row for 2 hours and 40 minutes without being allowed to speak even once. The presentation was delivered by an attorney from the offices of Meridian Wharf. He didn't mention Preston Halloran even once. He placed only 3 things on the table: the article from the Inquirer, the report from the Customs Inspection the previous month, and the 4-minute and 10-second recording of the television interview. He said the committee had no obligation to decide who was right and who was wrong. He said the committee's only obligation was to protect the reputation of the port. It was a very clean argument, and it worked, because clean arguments always worked on people who were already searching for a reason. The vote to suspend the lease pending further review was 9 in favor and 4 against. The bank called the loan within the next 24 hours. The material adverse change clause, line 17 in a contract no one had read carefully in 8 years. Rowan had 30 days to pay a sum he couldn't pay within 30 days. Not because he didn't have it, but because everything he had was tied up in the 3 cold storage warehouses that had just been shut down. On Wednesday morning, Piers A and C were sealed. Yellow tape with printed lettering was tied across the main gate and all 3 warehouse doors. A 30-year-old man wearing a federal agency windbreaker stood tapping on his phone while he waited for his colleague to finish locking everything. 400 workers received furlough notices that afternoon. Not termination. The word used was furlough, and anyone who had worked on that river long enough knew those 2 words usually meant the same thing. He had inherited all of it at 22, on a November afternoon when his father gripped his wrist from a hospital bed and gave him no choice. He lost it in 4 days. On Thursday afternoon, he drove to Pier A, parked 50 yards from the gate, and walked the remaining distance. The April wind came off the river, cold and damp, the kind of wind the people who worked there called salt wind, even though the river water wasn't salty. He stood outside the fence and looked in. 3 cold storage warehouses. The peeling enamel sign on the steel post outside Warehouse 1, its words still legible if a person stood close enough. The concrete road he had walked at 4 o'clock in the morning almost every day for 12 years. And somewhere beyond the fence, an unsecured cold storage door struck its steel frame in rhythm with the wind. A small sound, steady, repeating. He had first heard it in August of the previous year. He had written in his notebook that someone needed to tighten the hinge before winter. He had never repaired it. That was what remained in his mind as he stood there. Not the 9 votes in favor and 4 against. Not the clause on line 17. Only a door he had made a note about, and hadn't repaired. now striking its steel frame behind a strip of yellow tape, while no one was permitted to go inside and close it. He heard footsteps on the concrete behind him and didn't turn around. "I thought I'd find you here," Marin said. She stood beside him and looked through the fence. Neither of them spoke for a while. The door kept striking the frame. "I didn't come here to forgive you," she said. "I can't do that yet, and I don't know when I'll be able to." He nodded. He didn't ask her to. "But I kept you from bleeding out for 11 minutes when I didn't know who you were," she said. "And if it happened again tonight, I'd do exactly the same thing. It isn't about whether you deserve it or don't deserve it. It's my job." She turned and looked at him. "But this time, you have to let me see the wound first. You don't get to hand me an undamaged coat and stand there waiting to see whether I notice." The wind changed direction. The door struck the frame twice more. 400 families are waiting on the other side of that fence," she said. "They don't care how you feel right now. They care about next Monday." Rowan looked at the 3 cold storage warehouses. "I've used silence my entire life," he said, "and I called it discipline." Marin didn't comfort him. She didn't say he had done his best, or that everyone made mistakes, or any of the things people usually said. "Then don't," she said. 2 words. No framing, no explanation, nothing added, only 2 words and the expectation that he was capable of doing what they required. Rowan took his phone from his coat pocket. The ballpoint pen was still there, on the left side, above the scar. Preston Halloran made his only mistake on a Tuesday evening in a restaurant in Old City, when he told Sloane Ketteridge that he wanted to place her on the board of a newly formed company. He presented it as a gift. He said it was time her name appeared on the documents, instead of her merely standing behind other people's reputations. Then he pushed a folder across the table. Sloane thanked him, took the folder home, and did exactly what she had done for 15 years with every document that had ever passed through her hands. She read it. That was what Halloran hadn't accounted for. He had spent 11 months studying her as a weakness, and he had overlooked the most obvious thing about her. Sloane Ketteridge was the development director of an arts foundation. She had sat through 4 audits. She could read financial statements better than most of the accountants she had hired because, in her profession, a single, incorrect line in a corporate filing could make a $2 million grant disappear in one afternoon. She reached page 9 and stopped. Then she opened her computer and searched the Pennsylvania State Business Database, something anyone could search, and almost no one ever did. There were 4 legal entities. All 4 were registered in Wilmington, Delaware. All 4 listed the same registered agent address. All 4 were connected to transactions involving land rights along the Delaware River waterfront, including the Pier 34 North parcel, and on all 4, under the name of the authorized signatory, there was only one name: Sloane Ketteridge. Not Preston Halloran. Not Meridian Wharf. No other name appeared on any line of any of the entities. She checked the formation dates. The first entity had been registered on June 22nd of the previous year. Sloane sat very still in front of the screen. June 22nd had been 11 months earlier. It was 6 weeks after the fundraiser at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the night he had stood beside her at the bar and told her she was the only person in the room who knew what she was doing. It was 4 months before their first dinner together. 3 months before the first time he asked her about the safe in her husband's study. For weeks, she had reconstructed the entire story in her mind, in a certain order, that she had made a mistake, that she had fallen in love with the wrong man and had been used while she was vulnerable. It was a terrible story, but it was still a story in which she was a human being whose emotions had been exploited by someone else. The true sequence was different. She hadn't been used after falling in love. She had been selected as the sacrifice before she was ever courted. Her name had already been placed on 4 documents in Wilmington before he invited her to dinner for the first time. Everything that happened after June 22nd, every sentence, every dinner, every time he looked at her as though she were the only person in the room, had merely been the finishing process for something that had already been decided. She sat in front of the screen for 40 minutes. Then she opened the shared calendar he had granted her access to 2 months earlier to make scheduling meetings easier and had forgotten to revoke. There was a flight, Philadelphia to Lisbon, 6:30 Friday morning, business class, one way. Sloane called Rowan Castellani at 10:15 that night. He answered on the second ring. He didn't say her name. He only said that he was listening. She didn't greet him. She recited the names of the 4 entities, their registration dates, and the 3 words sole authorized signatory. She gave him the flight number. She spoke in the flat voice of someone keeping herself from breaking apart by doing nothing except reading information aloud. Then she stopped. "You never tried to humiliate me," she said. "Even when you had every reason to. Even after that interview. You could have released anything you had, and you didn't." Rowan didn't answer. "I didn't deserve that kindness," Sloane said. "I know very well that I didn't, but I'll try to become worthy of it." She sent everything to Odette Vance that night. 41 files. Corporate records, messages, schedules, screenshots of transfers, and even a recording Halloran himself had made during a meeting 2 months earlier and sent to her as evidence in case a partner turned against him. That same week, on the other side of the city, Rennie Doyle was arrested in Port Richmond over something completely unrelated. He sat in an interrogation room for 2 hours and said nothing. During the 3rd hour, when he understood how many years he was facing, he began to talk. He stated that 3 days after that rainy night on Passyunk Street, a man in a suit came to see him and paid him to do nothing at all, not to do anything more, to leave the record exactly as it was, to make sure no one went looking for anyone. He didn't know the man's name. He hadn't looked closely at his face. He remembered the watch. Odette Vance placed 3 folders on the conference table in her law office on Chestnut Street at 8 o'clock Wednesday morning, arranging them in the order she wanted Rowan to see them. The first contained the 41 files from Sloane Ketteridge, printed and numbered. The second contained the Yusuf Amari records, including the sworn statement he had signed Monday afternoon after his private attorney explained what those $400,000 would be called in court. The third was the thinnest, 4 pages, each one signed, with a notary seal on the final page. Dated September 14th, 2023. Odette was 47 years old, had practiced federal criminal law for 19 years, and had a habit of speaking so directly that many of her clients never returned for a second meeting. She rested one hand on the first folder and the second. "These 2 win the case," she said. "There is nothing to discuss. With what Sloane sent and Amari's testimony, I can put Halloran in a courtroom within 6 weeks, and I can recover your dock lease within 3 months. You will lose money, and you will lose time, but you will get back on your feet." Then she placed her hand on the 3rd folder. "This one is different," she said. "This isn't evidence against anyone. This is a confession to a criminal offense committed by one of your men, under your company's name, involving planning, money, and a law enforcement officer who was bought. If you present it during a recorded public hearing with 3 reporters sitting in the back row, you won't merely be exposing Preston Halloran. You will be confessing to the crimes of your own organization." She sat down. "And I need you to understand that no one is forcing you to do that," she said. "That envelope sat in a drawer for 3 years. No one knows it exists except you and me. Halloran doesn't have it. The police don't have it. That woman has a copy of the accident report, yes, but that copy doesn't prove who paid whom. Without Gus's statement, it is only an old piece of paper, and a story no one has enough evidence to prove." Rowan said nothing. He looked at the thinnest folder. Odette spent the next 48 hours on the phone with the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. She returned Friday afternoon with a single sheet of paper, and written on it was the price. Castellani Cold Storage and Freight would permanently surrender its lease on Pier B, the most profitable of its 3 piers, the one Silvio Castellani had secured in 1988 after 14 months of negotiations. It would pay a fine of $6,400,000 over 18 months. Every company record would be opened completely to a court-appointed auditor, and Rowan Castellani would personally remain under federal supervision for 5 years, which meant every phone call, every transaction, and every trip outside the state would become part of a file he wasn't permitted to close. In return, he wouldn't face personal criminal prosecution, and the company would be allowed to continue operating. Odette pushed the page across the table. "I have been doing this for 19 years, she said. "And I am going to tell you what I tell every client who sits at this table. You can bury this. You can burn those 4 pages this afternoon, and not one thing on this list will happen. Halloran still loses. You still win. You keep Pier B, you keep the $6,400,000, and you keep 5 years of your life. No one in the world will ever know because the only other person who knows can no longer speak." Rowan sat motionless for a very long time. He thought about Gus Ferraro lying on the 3rd floor with one hand still capable of squeezing another person's. He thought about an old steel desk from the 70s and a drawer that had become stuck. He thought about the 3 years an old man had stood on Pier A at 4 o'clock in the morning carrying 2 cups of coffee, while 4 pages remained hidden in his drawer, and he said nothing. Then he thought about a second-floor window in a building in Bensalem, the 7th from the left, and about a woman who had sat in her car in that parking lot for 40 minutes without starting the engine. He asked Odette Vance only one question. If I bury it, who has to live with it? Odette didn't answer. She had practiced law for 19 years, and she knew when a question didn't require an answer. Rowan picked up the pen. He signed at the bottom of the page, in the lower right corner, with the faint pressure on the final stroke of the letter I in Castellani, the small emphasis no machine could ever reproduce. The Port Authority Committee hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock Monday morning. He had 48 hours. The Delaware River Port Authority Committee meeting room opened at 8:45 on Monday morning, and by 9 o'clock, not a single seat remained empty. 3 reporters sat in the back row. 13 committee members were seated in a U-shaped arrangement. The attorney for Meridian Wharf sat on the left with the same folder he had used 4 days earlier, and the same clean argument he intended to use again. The recorder was switched on at exactly 9 o'clock, in accordance with public record requirements. The chairperson had barely invited the Castellani side to begin its presentation, when Rowan Castellani stood. Odette Vance remained seated. She hadn't said a single word about Preston Halloran, hadn't opened a folder, and hadn't placed one sheet of paper on the table. Rowan said that before his attorney presented anything, he had a document that needed to be entered into the record, and that the document concerned no other party in the room except his own company. Then he read. He read the date, September 14th, 2023. He read the intersection of Aramingo Avenue and Cambria Street. He read the license plate number of an 18-wheel refrigerated truck registered to Castellani Cold Storage and Freight. He read the driver's name and the date the man had been moved to Ohio. He read that a police report had been rewritten, that the testimony of a witness named Hoa Dang had been removed from the case file, that money had been paid, and that a shell fund had been created to transfer payments into the long-term care account of a patient. Then he read that patient's name into the record. Theodore Voss, 19 years old. The meeting room remained silent for about 20 seconds. No one turned a page. No one coughed. The Meridian Wharf attorney sat perfectly still with one hand resting on his folder, and he didn't lift it. Only then did Odette Vance begin. She presented for 40 minutes without raising her voice even once. She introduced the signature analysis from Baltimore and pointed to the place where the pen pressure on the final stroke didn't match. She introduced Yusuf Amari's signed statement, the $400,000 payment, and the date of the transaction. She introduced the 4 legal entities registered in Wilmington, each listing a single name as the authorized signatory, with a formation date of June 22nd of the previous year. She pointed out that the date came 4 months before any personal relationship the opposing side might attempt to cite. Then she played the recording. It was the recording Preston Halloran himself had made during a meeting 2 months earlier, and sent away as insurance in case one of his partners turned against him. His voice filled the meeting room in the flat transactional language of a man who had never believed anyone would one day hear it. He spoke about the parcel. He spoke about whose name would appear on the documents, and whose name wouldn't. He spoke about how long it would take for a name to become useless, and what would happen to that name afterward. No one in the room looked at the screen. Everyone looked down at the table. When the recording ended, the chairperson asked whether Rowan wished to say anything before the vote. He hadn't prepared anything. He stood and spoke briefly. My father said a port isn't made of concrete, he said. It is made of people who know one another's names. I held it together for 12 years through silence, and I called that silence discipline. And because I remained silent, things were done under my name that I knew nothing about. Today, I am no longer silent. I am not asking you to overlook anything. I am asking you to vote for the 400 families waiting behind that fence. He sat down. The vote to restore the dock lease was 11 in favor and 2 against. Preston Halloran was arrested at Philadelphia International Airport at 5:40 the following morning, 40 minutes before his flight to Lisbon was scheduled to depart. Meridian Wharf withdrew from the entire waterfront project within 9 days. Yusuf Amari was prosecuted and lost his medical license. Rennie Doyle received an additional sentence for his involvement. Sloane Ketteridge received 1 minor conviction after the court acknowledged her active cooperation and voluntary surrender of evidence. 2 years of probation and the permanent loss of her professional fundraising license. Rowan didn't ask the court to show her mercy, and he didn't ask it to punish her more severely. He allowed the process to decide, and he didn't follow the proceedings. Castellani Cold Storage and Freight permanently lost Pier B. The $6,400,000 fine was paid over 18 months. The company records were opened completely. Rowan Castellani lived under federal supervision for 5 years, and he never once complained about it to anyone. 14 months later, the Silvio Castellani Medical Center opened in Kensington. It was built on the former site of Cold Storage Warehouse 3, a 24-hour clinic that charged no fees, serving the neighborhood where Maren Voss had worked for 4 years and knew every street. 31 employees, 14 observation beds, a private counseling area on the first floor, with an entrance that couldn't be seen from the street, because Maren had said people wouldn't walk inside if their neighbors could see them entering, and Rowan had changed the plans during the second design meeting. Behind the building was a community garden, completely separated from the medical area by a brick walkway and a row of young maple trees. On opening morning, 4 neighborhood children were painting a blue whale nearly 40 feet long across the brick wall at the far end of the garden. One child spilled an entire tray of paint over his shoes, looked down at the 2 bright blue shoes, and burst out laughing. The other 3 laughed with him, and one of them deliberately stepped into the puddle of paint so his shoes would match his friends'. Maren watched through the second-floor window, and she didn't turn away immediately. She watched for longer than 3 seconds. She watched until someone called her name. The gurney with the crooked wheel from Corridor B at St. Bridget Hospital had been taken out of service during an equipment replacement the previous fall, and Maren had asked to keep it. She brought it with her on the first day. She turned it upside down in the first-floor hallway, found the exact bolt that had been loose for nearly 2 years, and tightened it with a wrench borrowed from the electrician. It didn't squeak anymore. Sloane Ketteridge attended the opening. She stood alone at the edge of the crowd, not dressed for a celebration, looking like someone who had come because she needed to see what had been built, not because she wanted anyone to see her looking at it. When her eyes met Rowan's across the garden, he nodded once. Nothing more. Nothing more was needed. His office was on the 3rd floor, with windows overlooking the garden. Hanging on the wall was the black wool coat he had worn on the day he signed the divorce papers. The 2 holes beneath the left ribs repaired with black thread, the stitching even and secure, done by Maren herself because her hands were more accustomed to suturing than those of any tailor, and because she had said throwing away a perfectly good coat was ridiculous. Beside it was a photograph of Silvio Castellani standing on Pier A in 1991, squinting toward the sun, looking at something beyond the edge of the frame. On the corner of the desk, inside a small wooden box with a tightly fitted lid, was the wedding ring. Rowan hadn't thrown it away. He kept it where he could see it every time he sat down to work. Not as a wound, not as a reminder of failure, but as proof of a chapter that had once mattered, had ended, and had helped shape the man now sitting in that chair. That Sunday, Maren drove to Ben Salem, as she did every Sunday. The row of maple trees beyond the parking lot was beginning to change color. She opened the newspaper and read the results from Saturday night's game, the starting pitcher, the score at the end of the 6th inning. She read in her normal voice, no more slowly and no more loudly, exactly as she had read for 3 years. Halfway through the 7th inning, the little finger on Teddy's left hand curled. Once. Then it stopped. Maren sat perfectly still. She didn't call anyone immediately. She watched that hand for about 40 seconds, and it didn't move again. When she asked, the nurse on duty said these things happened occasionally, that it might only have been a reflex, and that she shouldn't allow herself to hope too much. Then the nurse paused and added that it might not have been. Maren nodded. She turned the page and continued reading the 8th inning. Rowan Castellani didn't win because someone handed him something. He won because, in 4 days, he lost everything his father had left him, and he still chose to stand up and reveal the truth he could have buried forever, even though he knew exactly what it would cost him. Maren Voss didn't win because someone came to rescue her. She won because she kept a stranger from bleeding to death for 11 minutes without asking who he was, and because she returned to do it again the next day, and the day after that. People often mistake steadiness for weakness. They see patience and call it passivity. They see silence and assume there is nothing to say. They walk away believing they have won. But what they leave behind, the work we continue doing, the things we continue building, those belong to us. If this story remains with you, even in the smallest way, please share it with someone you believe needs to hear it today. Don't forget to press the like button and subscribe to our channel so that more compelling stories can reach you every day. And what we hope for most is to hear what you truly feel. What do you think about Maren? about Rowan, about Gus, and about the drawer he kept closed for 3 years. Had you been in Rowan's place? Would you have chosen to tell the truth as he did? Please leave a comment below, even a brief one, because we truly read every line, and we always want to listen to the words that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.